Thank you again for joining us for our webinar on lessons learned from grief, how to better support siblings, and for joining us today on SUDEP Action Day. SUDEP Action Day is celebrated annually to raise awareness around the world about SUDEP. And SUDEP is sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, for those that aren't aware. And SUDEP Action Day helps to inspire action to save lives. Only by talking about SUDEP and what it is and how to prevent it can we help reduce the risk of SUDEP. Again, my name is Allison Kukla, and I'm the Senior Manager for Programs and Partnerships here at the Foundation, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. I'm really excited to have you all joining us, and I'm grateful for the speakers who are joining us today. I am pleased to have with me Miss Adina Perry, a wife, mom, minister, and poet, and president of the Kayla Ross Perry Memorial Foundation. Ms. Nancy Karst, a social worker and bereavement coordinator at Akron Children's Hospital, and Ms. Jennifer DeBolt, a child life specialist also at Akron Children's Hospital. And they also have with them today their intern, Erin, who I'll let them introduce later. We'll be discussing healthy ways to understand and cope with grief, specifically with children and siblings. We'll also have time later on for your questions, so please make sure to put them in the Q&A box throughout our discussion, and we'll answer those at the end. Now I want to give a few minutes for each of our panelists to introduce themselves so you can learn about them before we get our discussion started. So we'll start with Adina. If you can, share a little bit about your background and what brings you here today, that would be great. So those joining us can learn about you, and then we'll go around the room to the other panelists.
I feel left out. I wish I was in Akron, right? My name is Adina Perry, and I actually was raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So Akron and Ohio and Pennsylvania, right around where I grew up. Now I live in the Maryland area, and I am the mother of 3 children. The oldest is Taylor, the middle is Christian, and the youngest is Kayla. And part of the reason why I'm here today is to share my story and how my family was impacted by SUDEP unexpectedly. Our youngest daughter, who is, her name is Kayla, was 26, and she left us abruptly and too soon. And we later found out afterwards that it was from SUDEP. And so part of our desire, and when I say our, I mean me and my husband, who actually couldn't be here because of work, are committed to raising awareness about epilepsy and specifically SUDEP, because we only found out about it because of Kayla passing. And we were exposed to it about 3 years before at an Epilepsy Foundation walk. We saw a booth and we saw SUDEP, but we kept walking. And so months later and years later, when she actually transitioned and we were speaking with both the doctors and representatives from the foundation, we were advised that basically it was SUDEP that unfortunately took her life. So I am honored to be here. At the same time, it hurts me to be here, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to share our story if it's going to help another family.
Thank you so much for being here. We're honored to have you here with us to share your story and your family's story with us. And I agree. I wish I could be in Akron too. So we can turn it over to everyone in Akron and go right down the line, maybe starting with Nancy, and introduce yourselves to everyone.
Sure, Allison. No, we've never really been the majority before, so this is kind of fun. My name is Nancy Karst. I am a social worker here at Akron Children's. I've been here 36 years. I'm in the position of bereavement coordinator, which means that I have the opportunity to meet wonderful parents like Mrs. Perry and their families after the death of their child and try to provide support services to the families afterwards. We have a program where we follow people for at least 2 years. And as you can imagine, I've been here a long time. I still see people from 30 years ago still too, sometimes, you know, if they want to retouch base and things like that. But it's really a privilege to be here with you and to be a part of this program. Jen?
Oh, sorry, I thought Erin was going to say hi. I'm Jen Duval. I'm a child life specialist here. I've only been with the team for about 5 years, but I support patients and siblings and families as they kind of journey through their medically complex and their diagnoses and living with chronic conditions. And then I support Nancy's role and do a lot of bereavement work and support families as well through the grief process and through home visits and support groups and other kind of services. So.
And we do want to hear from Erin. So Erin, please introduce yourself also.
Okay. Hi, my name is Erin. I'm a child life intern here. So I had the opportunity to choose a week to come and spend here in the palliative care unit. So I've had the opportunity to spend the last couple of days with Nancy and Jen and really learn about bereavement and how that can affect families and everything. So I'm just happy to be here to learn more and to see how you guys can teach others.
Well, we're glad you picked this week, and thank you for your introductions. And we're glad you all can be here. So I'm excited, like I said, to have you all with me, and let's get the discussion started. So, as I mentioned, today is Suit Up Action Day. And so first question I want to go with Edana. Yeah,
It's
Edana.
just like Dana with the E.
Yeah.
That's it.
Sorry, I had a tickle in my throat there. You had shared in your introduction how you first found out about Suit Up. How have you, dealt with finding out about Suit Up and raising that awareness since finding out about Suit Up?
So our first step was to go back to the physician at the time when Kayla had transitioned, because she had been diagnosed at age 11 and she actually passed at 26. So there had been roughly about 15 years that she had been going to her pediatric neurologist and, getting feedback and testing and things of that sort. But in those 15 years, there was no information shared with us, not a pamphlet or anything. And Kayla's life was not restricted by epilepsy. So, we just made modifications as we needed to with her sleeping, etc. And our thought was the worst that could happen to her would be that she would fall, have a seizure, and unfortunately pass. So that's how we operated in terms of in the house. We listened if she, fell because we thought she might hit her head. Fast forward, we decided to go to the Epilepsy Foundation walk in 2016. And we're there with our grandchildren and everything. We're enjoying the information, getting information, putting in our bags. And we walk by this booth and it says Suit Up. But I have to be honest with you, I was ignorant to it. When I saw Suit Up, I thought of SIDS, SIDS. And I thought, that must be about babies. This was my ignorance. We go on, and then of course, a year later, Kayla passes, and she passes in her sleep, and she had a seizure and her heart stopped. So at that point, as a parent, you're trying to find out answers. You're wondering why, and I'm sure the counselors would agree with me and nod. You're asking, why did this happen to my child? What could we have done to prevent this? Because we felt we were up on the latest therapies and things of that sort. And we went back to her at that point. It was an adult physician. And after some conversation, he shared that the medical community was kind of split at that point. they were split from because there was no real answers to SUDEP. And so they felt that one group felt that by withholding the information, they felt that was the better way because there was no real answer. But there was another group that felt the parents, those people suffering with it, had a right to know. And so they were split. And so I shared with him with tears in my eyes on the phone. I was like, as a parent, I'm already living with the worst thing that I could live with, thinking that my child could fall down, hit her head and have a seizure and pass. So you telling me about SUDEP is not any more traumatic that I have to deal with. And that as a parent or as a caring about a loved one, you owe it to give me the information and allow me to process it and determine how I will use it. And it resulted in me, this particular physician was on a board with the foundation, and we ultimately met face to face. And that's when the thought for me and my husband came about, like, we have to raise some awareness about this, because while we may not know why, again, as consumers, we deserve the right to know what things that are impacting our well-being. And for our children, for our spouses, whoever is dealing with epilepsy, we have the right to know. And so we are on that bandwagon with the Kayla Ross Perry Memorial Foundation, where we constantly are talking about SUDEP, talking about epilepsy, directing people to the foundation, because we know that there are services such as grief support services and other educational things that we've benefited from, and we want other families to know. And if we can prevent one family from having to deal with SUDEP, then we feel our mission is met.
Thank you for doing all that work. As a person with epilepsy, it means a lot to me personally, but I know the impact you're having in the community doing that work, and having that conversation with that provider, I know wasn't easy, but the impact it had, you can see in the community. And as you were talking about the grief work, leads me to the question I want to ask Nancy as we're starting the conversation. Can you define some terms for us? Can you define grief versus mourning versus trauma for our viewers, to help kind of lay the groundwork on what we're going to be discussing here throughout the next 40 minutes?
I'd be glad to. If I could first, though, say, I just thank you so much, Dina. You are the inspiration for us in that in our work in palliative care, we feel exactly the same way. We think that information is power, and that all families have the right to know that information. And I can tell you over the last 20 years, I've seen that even getting better because of people like you. So thank you. So my question was, what is grief? What is mourning? What is trauma? Grief is simply the natural human response to a loss. It's often grief is the distress that we feel after a loved one has died. Grief will affect us often in many parts of our lives. It can affect us physically. Physically, a lot of times people have difficulty with sleep regulation, eating regulation, just physical responses in our bodies that take place, whether it be headaches or stomach aches or things like that. Emotional reactions are all over the map. Probably a lot of people first think about sadness and depression and anger and guilt. Those are prominent, but there are so many more layers of feelings, and all that is normal and natural. We think about mentally how it affects us. A lot of people talk about having a grief brain, and that means it's like everything's foggy, nothing is clear. It's very hard to concentrate. It's very hard to complete tasks or remember what you're doing. So that's all part of grieving. It affects us socially. Sometimes we have a nice support network around us that can be supportive, and that is always to be celebrated. But many people don't have that, and grief can be very isolating, and people don't know what to say to you, and people are struggling with, do I talk about it? Do I not talk about it? So socially we're affected. And then as Adina just mentioned, in terms of the spiritual part, why is this even happening? It doesn't make any sense for a child to die. And so what is this world? It doesn't feel safe anymore. So that's kind of just a little bit of an overview of grief, of what that is. And one of my very favorite authors and educators and grief counselors is Dr. Alan Wolfelt. And he's a person who talks initially in his work about grief. And he says grief is actually the word used to talk about the internal feelings and thoughts that we have. So if you think of grief as more internal, we turn then to the word of mourning. Mourning is what we show outwardly. What are those external things that are happening? Sometimes it may be, the times that you're talking with a family or friend about what you're feeling. It can be those times of remembrance where we're, having a special celebration to talk about our loved one. So it's all those external things that are happening that way. And the last word you asked me to talk about was trauma. And I think that the suit-up experience is definitely a traumatic experience, as we just heard. I mean, it's totally unexpected. The world feels unsafe. So a trauma is a response to a terrible event that has happened, and that, you're going to have probably some short-term experiences with that, which would be, the feelings of shock and disbelief and denial, and that can be very prominent, and it can reoccur during the grieving process, but it's definitely in the beginning stages, very, very common. And then the long-term things are that, you're going to have unpredictable emotions, probably flashbacks of what happened, and sometimes a lot more of those physical reactions that I talked about earlier. So trauma is an entity in itself, and I'm grateful that you're kind of letting us talk about grief and trauma.
Definitely. Both of those are, grief and trauma is so important to the families that we work with and the individuals that we work with, as you pointed out, with not only SUDEP, but other epilepsy mortalities that happen in the community with accidents and different things that, happen with seizures. And then I want to talk with Jen with the next question, since we're talking specifically about children and siblings and grief. I know when we were talking, you had shared, depending on the age of a child, they'll experience grief differently. Can you share with our audience what to expect at the different ages involving grief and what it might look like for children?
Yes, I was actually also going to ask, because I think it also brings it home, like I have a whole developmental stages of toddler to preschool, school age and teenage years, and I'm happy to go through that. But when we were talking as a group of panelists before, as we were kind of preparing for this, I would love if Edana doesn't mind, kind of, because she had other children and grandchildren who were obviously impacted by Kayla's passing so profoundly. I would love the personalization of kind of what she saw her family go through at all the different levels of ages, and then I'm happy to back it up with more of that just category information. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure,
Okay.
absolutely. So at the time, which was actually 5 years ago, we have two granddaughters who were 13 and 8. So they were in two different ranges. And then Kayla has two siblings who are older than her. And at the time, again, one may have been 35, the other would have been 30, roughly. What we saw with our grandchildren was being, I guess, trying to be a little bit stoic, because they didn't want to add to our grief, because they saw how impacted we were, especially in those first few months during the funeral. When we were home, they would see us, me or my husband, weeping. And so we didn't get a lot of reaction from them early on. And later, my granddaughter, the older one, who is now 18, shared just recently that, again, even though she was hurt and sad that her aunt was gone, again, she just didn't want to add to our pain by outwardly showing, let's say, signs of mourning and things of that sort. But she did experience internal pain and sometimes might even have acted out in school because of it, but didn't necessarily want to bring her pain to ours because she thought it would just be too heavy. My youngest granddaughter, again, did not say too much, but we actually recommended for the both of them to go to some counseling. As it relates to my children, my son, he ultimately, while he was living with us when our daughter transitioned, he had the same issues that I did, where it was hard to come back to the house. So about a few months later, 4 or 5 months later, after Kayla transitioned, he moved out of town. And he later shared that it was too painful for him to be near anything that was associated with Kayla. And I understood that because even as an adult, I couldn't handle being in a house, and we ended up selling our house. And I know they tell you not to do things when you're emotional, but my repeated coming to the house and Kayla not being there was painful. So my son, shared that he just couldn't. And I think now, 5 years later, he's just getting more comfortable being able to talk about it. But he has his own method of giving honor and caring about Kayla and her life. And he does it by playing the music that she loved, by looking back at videos that him and her did together where they were singing. So that's kind of part of his therapy, is to utilize those things that bring him good memories. So there you go, Nancy.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and that makes so much sense. And I appreciate because I work with teens a lot, and parents of teenagers always tell me they don't want to talk about it. They refuse to talk about it. And it's very confusing. And I think that having that inside experience that you can bring to us and to educate us with is that maybe that's how these other teens feel too. They see their parents in so much pain that by acknowledging their own pain just might be too much, right? Or to put that on their parents' shoulders. So I appreciate that, because I feel like I'm going to take that with me, and maybe when I talk to parents, say I've heard another mom say, do you know what I mean? Or another grandmother say. But thank you. We know with toddlers, they don't understand death, and that you see it more through their play and through their behavior. And grief responses are very, I feel like the biggest one is clinginess, not, separation anxiety and clinginess and crying and, regression and what we love, which I know can be often embarrassing for parents, is that they will go up to complete strangers and say, my sissy died. Yeah, right. Just put it out there, no matter who, what, where, when. So that's very common. For 5 to 8-year-olds, they're still very concrete, and they see death as irreversible. So it's very common for a child to go to a funeral and see someone in an open casket and tell them, when are they going to wake up, right? So it's like that, still that inability to really understand that. And again, we see the same changes in sleep or eating habits or separation anxiety or a tummy aches, which is common. And then going to where your granddaughter, the 8 to 12-year-old, they understand that death is permanent, and just trying to navigate the world, no, all of a sudden the sacred space is not safe anymore, right? Bad things happen. And just again, that physical infliction of pain or discomfort, and then worries about things happening. From teenagers, there you go. I think, again, withdrawal from family, possibly, risky behavior, difficulty concentrating, intense emotional reactions. So Dana, like you said, getting in trouble at school, we had one of our teens who lost his brother recently, got in a fist fight, right? He won't talk about it, but he ended up in a fight at school. So you see the behavior, you see, and I feel, and I don't know if you can see this as your grandchildren have evolved and your own children have evolved, but you never get over it. It just becomes reframed in different ways developmentally as you go through life, right? So it's just how you understand it, how you make sense of it, how it integrates into your meaning of life. It just shifts. So
we're going to probably talk more about programming, but I'm grateful you also brought up your children being young adults. I think that's an often underserved population. A lot of people don't think about, when you lose a sibling when you're in your 20s and 30s. So I'm grateful you brought that up, and we can talk more about that too.
Sure. And let me share one other thing too. What we did strive, we did talk with our son and our grandchildren about not putting our pain on them and not putting expectations on them. So even if we decided to go to the grave site every Sunday after church, they didn't have to go. That was something that we did because that was what we wanted to do, and that it was okay if they did not choose to get out of the car or if they wanted to go somewhere else while my husband and I went to the gravesite. And one of the things, which I'm sure we're going to get into, but we chose to go to grief counseling. And that was one of the key things that the counselor talked about, was respecting the other person's process. And so in so doing, I had to learn how to do it with my husband. And then we had to then carry it over with anyone who was around us, whether that was our immediate family in terms of our children and grandchildren, or when we visited. We had to actually, and I would say, and if there's one thing I would say from a counseling perspective, is communication is the key, is that we also had to help the family along and say, it's Christmas, we don't feel like celebrating, we love you, but we're not going to be around the tree right now. But we also developed our own family celebration. So we would light a candle at Christmas time. We would ask our family, anyone who had lost a loved one. It wasn't just us who may have lost a daughter. You may have lost an aunt or whoever. We tried to develop alternative things to help us and also help our family.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We're definitely going to get into how to deal with your grief and how to advocate for where you are in your grief, because I know that is very important. And I know that people watching want to hear more about that. So thank you for bringing that up. But before we move into that, I want to go back to Nancy real quick, as we were talking about trauma, and get a little more specifics and a little more details about that. As we talked about, SUDEP is, or any epilepsy mortality, is really a traumatic experience. And, would you be able to tell us more about that overlap with a traumatic experience and the grief of loss and how that is overwhelming, and tell us about the different elements of trauma? I know you touched upon it a little bit earlier, but can you dive a bit deeper into what the different elements of trauma are?
Okay, I surely do. I think that, you bring up a great point, that I think as we've evolved in grief work and grief counseling through the years, we realize that there are almost two separate processes going on, so that when a sudden unexpected death happens, we call that a trauma, but at the same time you're grieving. And when I've worked with a number of parent groups, that if a person is truly in a state of trauma, which means you're usually in a state of shock, you're usually trying to navigate an unsettled world that doesn't make sense anymore, you don't feel safe, you feel out of control, you almost have to address that first, because you're not going to be able to deal with the grief work where you're trying to deal with all the other emotions. And so a lot of times when we've done our grief support groups, we always, if it's a trauma related death that way, we always address trauma first and then try to get that stability, and then you can do the grief work. I think that's the biggest takeaway that I've learned through the years with the two parts. because otherwise it feels pretty overwhelming for an individual to try to, how are you feeling about your grief? How are you dealing with these other parts of this process, and you're still not feeling safe? How can you do it? So it's a hand in hand, and I think it's really important as you find a counselor to kind of address that and make sure both are being done. But, again, it's just, I don't know exactly how to explain it more so just that, trauma is just so unsettling. And the flashbacks and the additional stress is just a lot to kind of manage at first. So I just think it's so important to do that. And then, as Adina was just describing, then you can delve into the grief process and what you're missing and how you're going to find ways to cope with what you're missing in your life, and how, I think, we'll talk about this later too, but there's just so many things about grief. Grief is unique for each person, as she described so eloquently. You have to kind of be so patient within a family to kind of meet everybody with where they're at, because it is so all over the map. And she had a large family, and everybody's going to do it their own way. So a lot of patience and understanding between everybody. And then, the grief journey, I think whenever a child dies, it is so profound on so many levels. It just is, a lot of times, a lot of the older theorists talked about stages of grief and processes, and I don't ever want to dismiss what they did. They contributed a lot to the field, but I think what we've learned over time is that there are no stages of grief. It is all part of a process, and it goes back and forth, and that to understand, especially with a child, it's going to evolve over time. And Jen was talking so nicely about how kids respond, but when you have a grandson, daughter, like you mentioned, at age 8, she's going to respond differently at 8, and then she's going to respond differently probably when she gets into high school years, and she's going to respond differently when she's off to college. I mean, it is a lifelong process, and I'm not telling that to people on the first day I meet them, because that would be too overwhelming, but it definitely unfolds as you do the work with families, that they realize that this is always evolving. So I don't know if that answers it for you, Allison, but help me to answer it better for you.
No, that definitely answers it. And I was going to ask Jen if she had anything to add from the child sibling perspective around trauma and helping them deal with their trauma before, kind of diving into the helping them with their grief.
I think, I just, my mind blanked, but the sibling piece, we always say in our support groups, and is, as a family, you're grieving as a whole unit, but in reality, everyone grieves very independently and individually, right? So just like Adina was talking about her son, like of getting out of town or remembering Kayla in his special way. And it's just like honoring each other's grief processes. But what I think with siblings is I always think of like the guilt, like why her, not me, and then identity, and just those underlying, threads of confusion and, relief, but guilt. Do you know what I mean? Just like all those emotions. And I read in one of the sibling books I have, they were like, the ocean of guilt that siblings feel sometimes, for being the healthy sibling or for being alive. And do you know what I mean? And not being the one that was sick or died, or either that died. So I don't know. I'm always intrigued by the sibling experience, and there's so much, I think, good information out there from sibs, and how then they have to kind of grow up without their brother or sister and figure out who they are in relationship to that. So
I may add just to what Jen was saying. I know we talked about this a lot too, but especially for younger children, but it can occur at any age, but you always feel like there's something you did that made this happen. And we're always trying to say to children that there was nothing you did to make this happen. We say this to parents all the time. There's likely nothing you did to make this happen, because it will kind of be a theme that occurs, and it will be worked through over time. And we fortunately see that resolve, but it is very, very common in the initial parts for them to really worry about that. And then also to worry about other family members. Like if it happened to my sister, can it happen to somebody else? Even though rationally we know that they don't have the epilepsy, but at the same time, your mind goes there kind of.
Sure. And just one other point is, it's so healthy for siblings to have their differences and to argue and to fight. You know what I mean? That's part of the sibling experience, right? So then it's like that shame or guilt if that's been occurring, and then, and then something bad happens. So I think siblings are one of the most complex relationships. So
No, thank you. That was all very helpful. And I know that comes up a lot in the support group that I help run at the foundation. And, the parents are always kind of wondering, like, how can we best support, the siblings now? And they've shared those themes a lot when we're talking about it in the support group. So yeah, those are definitely very common that come up. But I want to go back to what Adana, you were talking about and just started to kind of address about how you dealt with your grief and how you and your family or you and your husband dealt with your grief. What have you found to be most helpful? And maybe you even want to share what you found not to be helpful, that maybe you tried and were like, nope, this doesn't help at all.
So sure, I'll start with what necessarily didn't help in the beginning, because I was reading a lot of books, right? I was reading books on, grief, on the loss of your child and all that. My heart was asking for them to give me an answer. I would read the book. Psychologically, I was looking for someone saying, this is why, or whatever. And so reading the books did not necessarily help me with what I wanted, what I wanted was my daughter to be with me, right? But I did find a few books that were relative and helped me in terms of from an inspirational perspective. So in the end, the books helped, but initially they weren't giving me the answers that I wanted. They just couldn't, right? So I love books. So I'm an avid reader, and I kept reading. And again, in the end, death is final. So there's no way for the book to tell you that it's going to change in terms of what you really want. And so then you start thinking, well, I'm going to have to deal with this reality that is final if I'm going to survive this situation. And so the first thing that my husband and I did was looked into a grief counselor. We found one, and I am proud to say that we still see her now, even though she tries to discharge us. We see her now and we look forward to it. We don't see her as regularly. When we started out, we were seeing her once a week for about 2 or 3 months. Now we see her about every other month. But so that was the individual support that we got. And again, I'd say the original takeaway from being in the counseling session with her, with us also being a married couple, because we know that, when your child passes, that is a strain on a relationship between a husband and a wife. And that is what she had to keep drilling into my husband and I, was to respect each other way to grieve, where I tend to like to be more busy and my husband likes to be quiet and alone. And we had to learn to respect that. The other thing she taught us was those tools of communicating and recognizing that if something caused you a trigger, then you had to be empowered to remove that trigger or to remove yourself from whatever the trigger was. And for example, maybe being around Kayla's friends, who her age, who she grew up with, the first couple of months, it was hard for us to be around her friends, not because we didn't love them. When we saw them, we saw what was not there, and that was our daughter. And that was hard. That was hard. So she taught us that. In addition to individual counseling, we also sought grief support groups. And we actually really had 3. One was Grief Share, which is a faith-based group support group. Then we went to Compassionate Friends, and then we went to Bereaved Parents. And all of them provided different things to us at the time. And we still participate with bereaved parents on certain events. And so what we try to share, and what I would share to those who are listening, is just as the ladies, I say, we find the right person to do our hair, you find the right group that is good for you. Don't give up. You may go to one group and maybe that just doesn't flow well with you, but don't give up. And so ultimately, we appreciated the grief share because it helped us deal with our faith. And it gave us biblical responses to our pain. We appreciated the compassionate friends just for the fact that they were all, unfortunately, parents who had lost their family members. But the bereaved parents really connected with us because we were all parents who had lost their children, plain and simple. And it's a shame to say that, but that's where we felt the most comfortable during our process. And that's where we now help and participate in. And what is good, which sounds real bad, we never, in any of the groups, we never felt bad about weeping. We never felt bad about crying. We never felt bad about saying nothing, because the group's dynamics were such that whatever emotion you had or didn't have, it was okay. And so if we had, had a week of work where it was crazy, we knew on that particular day, we could come in, release that, there would be no judgment, and then we would move on. There would be the topic that we were talking about, but that's where the group helped us.
Wow.
No, thank you for sharing all of that, especially that tip that keep looking around and finding that good match. Because
Yes.
definitely, yeah, we've had that with the group that we provide where it was mostly moms for a while, but the
Right.
dads have started to come and kind of infiltrate the group, and all of that. So yeah, find that good match because they're out there for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing all of that. I want to give our Akron crew a chance to answer that too. Are there specific resources you would recommend or tips on how to advocate for where people are in their grief?
I think that what you kind of a natural from what she just described is we started about 15 years ago a family program called Good Morning, using the morning word, to serve families and children. So it started out, and it still is, children ages 5 to 18 who have had a loved one who's died, and their parent guardians. So we just, like Jen was talking, we just had our group last night. We do a 6-session series where we really focus on activities to walk through grief. We, walk the children through many different feelings that you'll have, ways that you can cope with those feelings, ways you'll always commemorate your loved one, and how you can build your own self-esteem and start the journey, because like we said, we feel like this is a whole journey. And so those children have age-appropriate activities at each of those levels. And then at the same time, we're meeting with the parents and guardians, because to my feeling, and I know many people's feeling, it's a whole family experience. So, helping them cope with their own grief and kind of getting a good foundation so that then they can then impart and be able to take in what their children are going through. Because I think, again, Adina, you've just been so very good in expressing yourself. But, in the beginning, it's hard enough for a parent to get up and just do the daily things you need to do, and let alone to try to have the time to understand what your child is going through. But if we can give them confidence to do what they need for themselves, then they'll have the confidence to take care of their kids. And that seems to work out pretty well. So that's one of the programs that we offer. Just a little step back from that, here at Children's, I've been very fortunate to have the ability to have a team of people working with me. And we're a hospital of about 200 or about 300 beds now, I guess, inpatient. We're an independent pediatric facility. So we probably have about 175 deaths a year. So those are mostly all sibling losses. There's a few adult losses in there because we have a burn center, but many, many families and children that are affected. So we try to reach out to them every 3 months with phone calls for 2 years, just to check in with them, make sure that somebody's remembering them, obviously providing support and information along the way. And so that's where it usually starts. But then we have the program I just described to you. We also offer a program just for the parents, very similar to what Adina described, but ours is very closed-ended. We only do 8 sessions and then we're done. They're not open-ended. So parents start and complete a series, and then they often go on to Compassionate Friends or Bereaved Parents USA as their groups. We also have a grandparent group, which I think is another unique feature, because a lot of times grandparents are forgotten too in this whole journey. So we do a very brief series with them. So Jen, what have I left out?
Followed. And we have a remembrance service, annual remembrance service that we invite families to.
We always have siblings participate in that also as best as we can. There's special readings that siblings make at that.
We have parent speakers.
And parent
Yeah,
speakers.
present, yeah.
Oh, yes, we will say hello to Dr. Forbes. Both of them are wonderful, wonderful people. Thank you.
We're having such a great discussion. I want to wrap it up here. I don't really want to wrap it up, but we have a question that came in that I want to ask both panelists, well, all the panelists here that I think will have insight to it. So someone had asked, when families are educated about SUDEP in advance, that siblings are aware of this risk and it'll affect the siblings and impact them. I see Erin nodding along. Do you have recommendations on how to support siblings in this situation when they learn about their sibling and the SUDEP risk? I don't know who might want to start, Nancy and Jen.
What do you think, Nancy?
I guess my first thought would be is, just like probably when the diagnosis of epilepsy was made, I mean, there was special ways that you would talk to children about that condition that would help them understand the basics of what they need. I think I say this so much and I hope it's correct, but I feel like this is always a story that is building. So, a child who is 4 or 5 won't know every dimension that as an adult that you're being told by the doctors, but at 4 and 5 it'd be like, your brother or sister might have what we call a seizure, and this is what a seizure looks like to you. And then they are encouraged, hopefully by you through the years, to ask more questions as you go along. But I think that if that is part of the scenario, that it probably should be also introduced at an age. I wouldn't think the real youngest ages, they're probably not going to understand the concept, but as they get older, maybe say, 8 to 10 to 12, that, that if that is something that is, part of the family's experience, just because I think what the worst part, I think, for children is they know that everybody else is talking about something and they don't know what you're talking about. And it's like even makes it even worse sometimes. So that, again, just to build a story, we learned about something that's kind of scary and we're not thinking this is going to happen today or tomorrow, but we want you to be aware of this. And again, ask more questions. That would be my initial thought.
Yeah, I think so too. Just that when you said 8 to 10-year-olds, they like information, right? They want details, they want information. They, how often could this happen? Is it going to happen? Just like getting very basic, simple information just to like kind of reframe the perspective and, from worst case scenario to like what's really, just that information medically sometimes too. But yeah, I think what Nancy said is spot on. It's kind of like, it's open communication, it's supportive, but I don't know. And I guess, Dana, you're the one who's such an advocate for SUDEP now. What do you recommend? Like, what would you do in the future? What would you do?
I totally agree with you both, because we constantly would be sharing with our grandchildren. Those were the ones who were always in the house with Kayla around. She was either watching them or whatever. And so as they got older, we just explained a little bit more, like, if you hear a noise, go check in your aunt's room because she could be having a seizure. Or if you hear a thump, go check on your aunt to make sure she's asleep, because that was one of the things. Kayla needed more sleep. So we just kind of incorporated it because, again, we did not want it to manage us. We didn't want epilepsy to manage us. We wanted to try to manage the epilepsy. And so, it was no big deal. Go check on your aunt, or if you hear a noise, she went in to take a shower, I need you to listen for me if you hear anything. So I believe in, and because you guys are the subject matter experts, age appropriate information, but consistently keeping it there but not overly causing them to be scared.
Right on.
You are so good. You're going to be excellent passing the word along.
Yeah.
I was
Excellent.
gonna say, you are also a subject matter expert, and I
Yeah, she is.
Akron would agree with me as well.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, I don't really want to end the discussion. It's been so lively, and I think we could probably go on for much longer, but I want to be able to share some of these resources on slides I put together. So I just want to thank everyone so much for joining our discussion and for your support of the Epilepsy Foundation and your support of Suit Up Action Day today. And I want to thank all of our panelists that joined us today, and thank you for sharing your expertise and your very personal stories and experiences with us and with everyone that joined us. If you found value in this webinar, it has been recorded, and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel, where you can find other videos on many other topics as well. So we'll be able to get that recording out. I'm going to pull up a slide here with some of the resources that we talked about so that you can see those. As we shared, the Epilepsy Foundation offers bereavement support services for families and individuals who have lost someone due to epilepsy. So you can see here the different services that we offer. If you're interested in any of these services, you can reach out to us at sutup@efa.org, and we can get you connected to those. And then you can also see the additional services discussed during the webinar today for families and siblings. You can see the National Alliance for Children's Grief, the Dougie Center, Courageous Parents Network, and the Kyla Ross Perry Memorial Foundation. We also have the Partners Against Mortality and Epilepsy, or PAMI partner, that hosts a multi-stakeholder annual conference that is focused on raising awareness and understanding of all forms of preventable epilepsy-related mortality. These meetings are unique as they convene healthcare providers, public health officials, advocates, death investigators, people living with epilepsy, caregivers, and bereaved families around a shared agenda. This year's meeting will take place in Nashville, Tennessee. You can see the dates there on December 1st and on November 30th. November 30th is a special Family Day meeting that is targeted for advocates, caregivers, and bereaved families. And December 1st is an all-day conference. If you'd like more information, you can again email us at sutup@efa.org, and we can get you connected. Also wanted to share about our seizure first aid training. If you haven't been certified, our seizure recognition and first aid certification training provides information to increase the knowledge, skills, and competence in recognizing seizures and safety and administering first aid to those who might have a seizure around you. Participants who successfully complete the course will receive a 2-year certification. So we have different certification courses on that, and we have that available on our website and in our learning management system. And lastly, we have our 24/7 helpline that is always ready and available to help you out. So if you ever need anything or have any questions, you can contact us there. You can see the phone numbers there. We have it available in English and Spanish, or you can email us at contact@epilepsy.com. So again, just want to thank you for joining us today. And again, thank you to all of our panelists for being here. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.